Welcome, everyone. My name is Drew Beaupre. I'm CTO at Mammoth Growth. Today, we're going to be talking about changing platforms, specifically data platforms, and all the challenges that go along with that. With me today, in a sort of roundtable format, we've got all from Mammoth Growth as well: Ben Wilson, John Morrison, and Dylan Cruz. You guys want to introduce Ben? You want to go ahead?
Hey, Drew. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm Ben Wilson, and I've been wearing the hat of a tech lead and senior analytics engineer for the last 2 years with Mammoth Growth.
Hey, I'm John Morrison. I've been at Mammoth for a few years now, doing a mix of consulting work on MarTech stuff, as well as getting more into the data engineering and consulting on that side. I'm currently doing a mix of tech lead or tech architecture work, depending on what the client needs.
Hey, I'm Dylan. I just joined Mammoth about 6 months ago, but I am an architect here. I have about a decade of consulting experience in the data engineering and data architecture space, and looking forward to chatting today.
So ultimately, we're all in the consulting space, but for the most part, it ends up being more like in the problem-solving space. And today's problem that we're going to kind of chat about is when we have to change some kind of fundamental building block in our data stack. There's kind of all sorts of reasons why someone might want to change their platform. Sometimes it's just they're on something that was the right platform to be on, maybe 5, 10 years ago. But really now it's really starting to show its age, or sometimes it was just kind of a quick and dirty sort of thing in order to do like really early answers. But now they're ready to sort of mature a little bit in terms of their tech stack. And sometimes it was just misguided. They thought it would be a good solution, and it hit a wall pretty quickly. And ultimately, what are the sort of things we're talking about? Could be your data warehouse, that's actually storing and running your queries. Sometimes it's how you're transforming the data. Sometimes it's even the BI tool itself. Any of those things and all of those things can be swapped out at any time, and there's different challenges, and sometimes the challenges are way bigger than anyone ever thought when we're replacing those things. First things first is why don't we talk about some of like the legacy platforms that we have come across in our years when we sort of get the request from a client when they want to make a change. One of the platforms I find really challenging is when someone has sort of like a pure data lake, and they want to move away from something like Presto or Athena, and a lot of the times it's really because they didn't realize how expensive it was really going to be, and all the problems that go along with sort of data lake. But Dylan, what are some of the legacy tools and platforms that you've come across?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't see it as much anymore, but definitely just scattered on-prem SQL servers, right? They have 50 different SQL servers throughout their organization, and they each house a different data set. They each had their specific use case at one point, and now there's just too much to manage. And so a lot of that, we start to think about how do we consolidate all these 50 on-prem, or even if they are in a cloud provider, how do we consolidate these multitude of different servers into one central platform. So, and then I think, as you mentioned, the data lake came about, and we started seeing a lot of that leveraging Athena. And as you mentioned, that gets very expensive very quick when you have a bunch of people writing not cost optimized queries against that thing. You run up a bill pretty quick. So
yeah, we gotta forget. Not long ago, people were running on-prem databases.
not that long ago at all.
Not that long, but it's like it just seems so. It seems so far away.
It really does.
Yeah, Redshift gets a lot of credit for kind of spearheading this massive parallel processing databases. So they separate, but it begins to break down because there's no separation between the storage and the compute. So it's one cluster, you keep having to upsize it. And again, you start hitting that cost barrier or performance barrier. And so eventually your pipelines break down and you need something more powerful.
Yeah, it's another area where we've really got a little bit spoiled in the last few years is being able to think about scaling data storage and data compute independently from each other.
I mean, it's fascinating because it wasn't long ago at all where Redshift was the go-to platform. I mean, this was like 3-4 years ago where everybody was moving to Redshift, and then very quickly became legacy technology.
Yeah, there have been attempts to update it, I think, and there are things like a serverless Redshift and things like that now, but it's a bit behind. And I think one of the main problems you run into is just the difficulty of configuration. Like you really need to be an expert in Redshift to take advantage of these features that are kind of more out of the box with other solutions. Yeah, thinking a little
John,
bit
in your
about
experience, why is that? Why is there a more attention to detail necessary on Redshift?
I think it's really just a design choice that was made early on, or maybe a choice that wasn't so much explicitly made as the fact that Redshift was an extension of AWS as a wider environment. It was a tool that you could build as part of, your S3 and everything else. The people setting it up were more likely to be hardcore software engineers rather than, the main stakeholders for other solutions, which are probably, business and analyst users that aren't as technical. And so what seems like an okay trade-off for a software engineer may be different than what's a good trade-off for an analyst or someone that's trying to handle these things, their own way, which is, in something like BigQuery that's very much abstracted away and you don't have to worry about scaling up compute at all. It's something that's Snowflake. It's very easy to configure compute as separate blocks, and it helps you make good decisions and kind of presents a friendly UI on top of it to make that fairly straightforward.
One thing about Redshift that's always confounded me is the settings for setting your ability to run concurrent queries and how buried and difficult it is for you to change that.
It can result in very strange behaviors as well. Building up a concurrency budget, so getting the ability to run things more in parallel, over time means that there's almost a race to use that concurrency. If you're coming in first thing in the morning, like depending on how it's built up, queries can run faster or slower depending on when you're approaching it. And so it results in some very strange kind of behavior, especially when you're trying to figure out how to optimize.
Thankfully, I haven't come across Postgres analytics databases lately, but that used to be pretty common a couple years back, where a company would they would just sort of do all of their analysis in a Postgres database. And it got to a point where some clients were, their ETL jobs were pushing 24 hours. And so they just like literally couldn't keep up at all. Thankfully we haven't seen very many of those these days.
Well, I've seen, not recently, but like they use it as a transactional database at first, and then they're like, oh, we have it stood up, so let's build some analytics on the side as well. And then all of a sudden, like you said, their warehouse is taking 24 hours to try to handle both use cases, and it gets ugly pretty quick.
Yeah, we won't get into the details of OLTP versus OLAP, but it's definitely a reason to choose the right tool for the right job. What about like to sort of on the transform layer? So in the past, early on when I was sort of trying new things, I was trying using AWS Glue and under the hood Spark SQL. What are some of the like sort of legacy transform layers that we're seeing that clients are trying to get off of?
Yeah, Dylan brought up some bad memories talking about SQL Server. We just had loads of stored procedures that were stuck into like a shared drive folder, and no version control, no scheduling of it. It was just really hard to maintain and keep track of what all the dependencies were. Some of the more modern data tooling really helps build up those dependencies so that you can get a complete picture and know what's referencing each other.
SSIS is still actively used.
So I was just going to say, I had a project a couple years back of just massive SSIS packages that had to migrate to Azure, and it's luckily Azure's grown in some instances where you can kind of leverage the same packages in the cloud, but it still is not a seamless transition by any means.
What about Airflow? Have you guys come across any Airflow migrations?
It's been used extensively, but not directly migrating it. I think it's a useful tool. Again, it sort of requires specific expertise. But yeah, the downside is that it does make the transformations or the scripts you're running more opaque. And again, it's sort of harder for non-engineers to access that layer.
So, like, okay, why do we find clients are wanting to move from one platform to the next? Is it what is your experience in terms of trying to sort of understand like who's the primary stakeholder of wanting to make this change, and sort of what are their motivations?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. It's one of my favorite questions to ask when working with a new client is, why are we here, right? What was the incident or the thing that couldn't happen that resulted in us, coming in to try and make a change? Um, it's often not that there is any one thing. I think it's more that there's been a noticeable decline in the ability to keep generating, either new features or new understanding to implement some kind of new, way of targeting for marketing or implementing some kind of tool. And the reality of that is that there's no silver bullet solution to a lot of these things. It's sort of it involves going back and looking at, how have you set things up? Why has it become this way over time? And how can you change the whole of it to make it fit your needs? One of the big issues I think with platform change is that things may be just sort of generally bad. There may be a lot of different kind of problems that exist, but without a clear focus on what you're actually trying to achieve with the change, you may end up in kind of the same place. It's a good chance to reset a bit, and you can take advantage of that, but you have to plan effectively ahead.
Yeah, I like the idea of, we have to understand the original context. Otherwise, why would we think that we're not going to fall into the same patterns?
I think that's why our approach of tackling an MVP first works very well, because you're taking one thread all the way through, you're proving out the tech stack, you're using best practices, you're laying that foundation, and you really prove that value of that new platform. And then you can go on to layer on those other legacy pieces or the other portions and grow that out. But starting, I don't want to say small, but starting very refined in how you're building out the platform really helps that success.
Yeah, and it also helps the client themselves to really start to learn the platform itself. Like, we want them to understand why you don't. Usually, a new platform has a new way of thinking about the problem and solving the problem. And by starting off, slowly, it gives the client time to really adjust to kind of the new paradigm. Because a lot of what makes these new platforms powerful is that they do bring a new paradigm.
Well, the new tech skill set too, right? Is their engineers have been building out SSIS packages for the last 2 years, and now they have to learn DBT or whatever that new layer is. And so, it's not easy. It's not a shift that happens overnight.
John hit on a key phrase for me. It's a good chance to reset. And, it's not just the tech that changes over time, but the business changes over time. And I went through with a client a merger. Two businesses were coming together, and it was a good chance to reset what tech they used to bring the understanding of the two businesses as one complete entity.
Yeah, that's right. If we just take what they have and migrate it over, you're also taking all that historical baggage along with you that might really be acting almost like as an anchor. It's not. It's preventing you. It was potentially one of the root causes of the platform problem to begin with, and now you're bringing it over into the new one. So, what kind of So we talked about where they're coming from, talking about why do they want to change? So where do we go? What are some common, the data loading? There's an opportunity there. Like I've had clients who were really struggling with Amazon database migration service and the EC2 instance that it was running out of memory, every few days, and then having to do a full recatch up, which caused a pager duty call at like 3 a.m. because reports were late. So there was a really bit strong motivation to find a more robust system, and so there's lots of different solutions for moving data from A to B. but there's not that like there's a lot of solutions, but not so many like tested and trusted solutions. In the data warehouse space, again, there's a lot of different solutions out there, and on the transform side, less options. But where are we moving to these days when clients are giving us a call?
I think we have a pretty standard modern data stack. You use an ingestion service, a managed ingestion service like Fivetran or Stitch, put it into a new cloud data warehouse, Google Cloud Platform, BigQuery, or Snowflake. And then we set DBT and all those developer best practices that come along with Git. And then we have a buffet of BI tools to park the data in.
It's almost like, yeah, there's not that many. When you put them all together, you've got maybe like two or three options at each level, and you can mix and match any of those to bring it all together. But ultimately, it's kind of it's a similar pattern: loading the data in, having a robust, scalable warehouse to execute on new queries, having a this well-managed, source-driven, analytics engineering platform, and then ultimately a high-quality BI tool on top of that.
Interesting today that there's 1,000 different tools out there. I mean, they come out of the woodwork every day now, but we have continuously seen through hours and hours of engineering and thousands of projects that tool set continuously works over and over for every client that we come across. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I see like data warehouses come out that are, really focusing on the benchmarks, trying to be, faster than all the rest. But at the end of the day, it's usually plenty fast, the tools that we have, and it's more about how easy is it to use? How many people, like, how many hours do you need in order to manage this warehouse? Is it mostly self-optimizing? When you do have a problem, how quickly can you find out what the problem is? And I think that really, tells the maturity of some of these tools. Even trying to go back to Redshift and trying to debug, why it maybe not be working. It's like it's challenging. Like, you got to troll through like XML outputs of the explain plan, and it's not the easiest thing.
And just initial configuration as well. We don't have a lot of time with our clients to start showing value. And so the fact that we can get a full environment set up within a day or two is priceless, really.
So I'd love to hear some anecdotes on some of the platform changes that we've run into. John, you've got one of my favorites. Why don't you walk us through sort of the when we to sort of tee it up, like often when we're going into a new platform migration project, we just really have limited information, and we're coming in with as much information as we possibly can, but there's always something that gets us every single time, and it's always, no matter how many different scenarios we see, there's always something that surprises us.
Yeah, so I worked at a business once. They were attempting to migrate. Really, the main thing they were hoping to change was their modeling logic and their transformations. They're operating in a Redshift environment, and they had some generic sort of scripting tools that were combining SQL-based scripts with sort of procedural scripting to kind of create a combined version of they sort of hacked together a version of DBT that also did iterative, like imperative type logic as well. The thing that made things much more complicated was that they were operating at the absolute limit of their Redshift cluster. So they could not afford to scale that any further. And it was sort of running into queuing issues a lot of the time. And the size of the data they were operating with was very large. Now, when you're working with that kind of a problem, the first thing we try to do is to understand, what is the purpose of all these transformations that are happening in the first place? Like, what's the kind of output that we're aiming for? and how might we do that in a tool like dbt in the way that's kind of clear, where you can invite more people to make changes and get buy-in from the stakeholders. The issue that we ran into like pretty early on was that there really was nobody there who knew the whole of the thing. Many people had left, and so you were left trying to reverse engineer from these scripts how the transformations worked in the first place. And then at each stage there, even interrogating that was difficult because of the constraints on being able to even query data of that size without creating disruption to the other users of the Redshift cluster. As an aside, this is maybe one of the most basic kind of configuration errors that we see with something like Redshift, where if you don't create sort of good queuing to separate out the BI tool that's trying to hit it from the data loading, from the ad hoc queries and transformations that are happening, that kind of a clash can become a big problem for productive use of the warehouse. Ultimately, the problem boiled down to the methods that they were using to load the data and to try and transform it involved doing a lot of edits to this data at scale. So even whilst loading it, they were having to make changes, which meant that they couldn't take advantage of anything like incremental models without losing track of state. And so it ended up being an awful lot of complexity to manage each of these kind of complicating factors without a good kind of clear end goal in mind. And so trying to sort of diagnose the next steps, our recommendation in this space would have been something along the lines of fix the way that you're collecting data in the first place, be very thoughtful and considerate about how that is happening and make sure it's focused on your end goals. And then probably at some point try and move to a new data warehouse environment that will enable you to take advantage of that, ease of configuration, ease of splitting up the warehouse load, so you can start to get a handle on these kind of complex transformations that largely exist only because you have so many issues with the data loading and reuse in the first place. So it was a case where a lot of different issues piled up at once. I think we were able to make a good dent in starting to understand the core of what the business was aiming towards, in particular trying to find areas where work was repeated. So one thing that is another kind of common problem, not necessarily with configuration, but as business grows, they may run into a case where every part of the business is running their own transformations, separately on top of the raw data. And when for any business, most parts of the business care about the same kinds of things. They care about, maybe it's orders, maybe it's, customer sort of session type information. But if everyone is trying to operate on that at once, and you never get to a stage where you've pre-computed or you've agreed on how you should handle these things, you're ending up with 10 different versions all tackling these very large data sets, and it's just fundamentally inefficient. So we tried to move them towards a state where they could all agree on the kind of core transformations, so that work was only done once, and then everyone can operate on top of that kind of well understood core to get their specific needs out at the end. That's really a great use case for something like dbt, where you can encode that kind of structure and also make those changes visible to everybody. So you can, by adopting software best practices, including pull requests, including documentation, you can make those changes all explicit and get buy-in at every stage, and hear everybody's needs for that kind of common core set of assets, whilst tackling something like your out of control compute costs, because you are avoiding repeating a lot of that work over and over.
Ben, you've had a situation where there was a choice that the client had to make: stay on Redshift but do the work in Redshift, or migrate to Snowflake and kind of almost start anew. What was your experience in the sort of the pros and cons of those two options?
Yeah, it was. We talk about what are these migration strategies, and so we had to trace back, the existing queries, decouple what logic exists, and then try to lift and shift that over to the new platform. But there's different query syntaxes between Redshift and Snowflake, and then the data that comes over, you end up comparing apples and oranges, even if you're trying to stay as close to the original code as possible. It never quite turns out the same.
That's always the biggest challenge, is you're really almost never going to achieve a perfect migration because usually the source is flawed to begin with. So how can you ever truly demonstrate that what you've actually done is more correct, unless you have access to sort of secondary sources of truth, and potentially come to the agreement that it's time to maybe rethink the whole thing and actually start with a small MVP and rebuild it from the ground up. Not, maybe not necessarily complete scorched earth and start completely from scratch, but at least reimagine what those core components are, so that you're reimagining what those common sort of objects and metrics are that you want to model, and then start building out the new platform from that. I had one client years ago where they knew that this executive report, like no one trusted it, and we made the attempt to actually redo it and fix it at in place at the same time, but then the executives were complaining that it didn't match the old report, like, but the old report was wrong. And like, well, how do we know that this one's not wrong as well? And so it's always a big challenge when you're dealing with that, setting expectations, and then also ultimately proving you have to prove that the data you're producing is trustworthy, even in the face of everyone knowing that the old was not.
I think one thing to think about as well is that it's sort of scary for businesses to think about replacing something as fundamental as like a data warehouse or some kind of like large scale, think of all of their reporting, right? But it's interesting when you start digging in to actually figure out what is being used. You may find that when you start to look at the kind of core reports, things that have the most sort of eyeballs on them, that is a lot less than the surface area of what is actually being produced in the warehouse. And that can give people, I think, confidence sometimes that, okay, if we try and work on tackling these, these main core parts of something, you can get a lot of the way quite quickly in a new solution. And the stuff that doesn't get migrated over may actually not really be necessary in the first place. It's not about having a one-to-one shift of everything over. It's about taking the most valuable and assets that are being referred to a lot and making sure that those things are, moved over in a really clean way where they have a lot of trust associated with them by how they've been, very carefully rebuilt in a new environment. I think it's there are ways of doing this. Like one of the main ones is to go and interview people and actually get their first person perspective on what they find the most valuable. Especially in an environment where there may be like a lack of trust in the data, you can figure out what people do find valuable and what they kind of maybe consider to be a bit suspect. But also just objectively looking at if you have something like a BI tool where you can see usage stats for different reports. You'll very often find that it's sort of parallel distributed, where there's a small number of dashboards and reports that have a lot of eyeballs on them, and a long tail where there's maybe not so much, and it's something that you can go and refer to the kind of individuals that maybe have a better view in that.
I think that's interesting that you mentioned in a BI tool, because I think that's where I've historically seen a lot of redundancy, as well as everybody kind of builds their own flavor of the same report over and over and over. Now there's 30 different dashboards that could have just been solved with a single filter or something. So like you said, interviewing those stakeholders, understanding what's being used goes a long way. Sorry.
Dylan, you want to talk about, so when should people know when it's time to be thinking about platform migration, and what do they do?
Sure. I think there's going to be some red flags that start surfacing. I think, how long does it take to maybe add an enhancement or add a new data set or make any sort of change to this data warehouse? Is it starting to get longer and longer and longer in my time to value because of the complexity that's already in my current existing platform? I think you'll start to see that time to value just evaporate. And so that may be a time where starting to think about a new platform. I think costs, because of the complexities and the inherent technical debt that just seems to snowball in these legacy platforms, your costs start spiking. You mentioned that Postgres instance running 24 hours. You're just starting to push the limits of the current platform. So I think there's a number of cases there, like I said, cost, performance, and time to change, Another one I think, John, you called is a new business case. The business has changed. The business has grown. Ben, you mentioned that you had to consolidate. They had a merger. There's a couple different businesses coming together. So I think something pivotal like that is also a great time to kind of reset, rethink your best practices, rethink your tool stack, and probably migrate to a net new platform.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your time, and that was a great chat.
That was fun. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.